I'm telling you, man, this is a cool movie. They stick cool scenes and cool shots because this is just a cool ass movie.
Hey, I'm David.
And I'm Alon.
Welcome to I Finally Watched, where we talk about movies that at least one of us has never seen before. And today, I finally watched Reservoir Dogs.
So, David, what do you think of Reservoir Dogs?
I liked it. It's obviously like a highly regarded movie by film fans, like film buffs. I think what's so amazing about it is it's basically Tarantino's, first film, and it's on such a limited budget. So working within those confines to make such kind of a masterpiece is just really amazing. I think that makes it that much more amazing.
You definitely get a lot of Quentin Tarantino's his tropes. I guess it's his first movie, so you can't quite call them tropes yet. But you have the violence, you have the language, you even have like the bright red blood that he's pretty famous for. But also, I see a lot of like story structure as well. The plot is kind of a who's done it in a way that on the team of thieves, there's a mole and they're trying to figure out who the mole is. And you see a lot of that kind of who's done it storyline through his other movies. Even if they're not the main storyline in his other films, there's definitely scenes dedicated to that plot point. One thing that I'm reminded of is that scene in Inglourious Bastards that they're trying to not that they're trying to figure out who the American is in all the Nazis in a room full of Nazis, but how the American gave away that he was an American and not a Nazi
He was a Brit, but yeah.
or a Brit. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the two things I noticed that were so Tarantino in this movie is like the non sequitur dialogue, where it starts off with him explaining. Well, it starts off in the car scene, but after that, where's the diner scene first? The diner scene where he's going on about like the song "Like a Virgin" and explaining what it's about, and it's not actually about being a virgin.
Right.
And then his appreciation for music. Tarantino loves to put different types of old new music in his movies, and so seeing that from the beginning, he he had his style from the start, and it's just become more polished throughout his movies until now. It's just so great.
Yeah, exactly. No, I was actually really surprised when I first saw this, what they accomplished with such a low budget and the fact that it is such a highly regarded film. To me, I feel like this type of film is just like a really cool film. Like just the way it starts and you notice the slow-mo walk that
He stole from Swingers, yeah.
yeah, he's still. Yeah, I just think it's like a really just kind of a smooth film, really cool, a cool guy's film.
Yeah, I there was also, I think, the story is just so well thought out. I was watching it a second time, and they talk about how the cops just came out of nowhere, and he was like, Mr. Pink's describing it should take cops 4 minutes to get there, but these cops were there a minute after we got there, and Mr. White, Harvey Keitel, is like, well, yeah, it's crazy because the alarm goes off and then I look and the cops are there. And Mr. Pink's like, well, no. Mr. Blonde started shooting and then the cops showed up. And as this was happening, I was like, why were the cops there? Because in the end, Mr. Orange says that, oh, the cops are trying to get Joe. This whole operation is to get Joe Cabot, this kind of ringleader gangster. And then it's revealed that the cops didn't reveal themselves until Mr. Blonde started shooting everyone. And then it's like, that makes sense. Like that whole story ties together because the cops weren't going to do anything. But then Mr. Blonde just starts executing people in the jewelry store. And it's like the cops just can't sit there and allow that to happen. And so then they react and then they kind of try and do something. So I think like the story is so simple, but it's so well thought out with just like the tiny details that just tie together really well.
I noticed a lot of, like you said, tiny details that tied together. I noticed that in the very first scene, the diner scene, kind of after they talked about Like a Virgin, and the camera is panning around the room. You have a lot of because all the characters are there. All the characters are sitting at that diner. I guess, yeah, it's kind of like a diner. Um, and you have little moments like how Harvey Keitel takes away Joe's book to show, like, yeah, Joe's the leader, but he also has respect for Harvey Keitel's character. And there's not tension, but he'll stand up to Joe. You know, there's that certain respect. And then you have Steve Buscemi's character, Mr. Pink, that he won't tip. So you kind of get into the, like, his mind frame. It's like, okay, he's kind of a not so much of a cheapskate, but he looks out for himself. You know, he's kind of number one, and he has very little empathy for others.
He's also an idealist.
And he's also an idealist. And then you have Mr. Blonde, who was like, hey, Joe, if you want me to shoot, what was Harvey Keitel's character?
Mr. White.
Mr. White, that's right. You want me to shoot Mr. White? I'll be glad to do it. And, you know, they get a real close up, and he does some finger guns to so, you know, kind of just a hint of his violence right there. Yeah, and you can even see Joe kind of like not really trusting Mr. Orange on, I think he said something about, you know, Joe misspoke and Mr. Orange corrected him, and Joe was like, hey, don't correct me. You know, so I think there's little moments in the very first scene that quickly establishes who they are and their relationship to each other.
Yeah. I will say, though, that in that first scene, it sort of paints Mr. Blonde, Vic Vega. You find out his name is Vic Vega later, but it paints him as, I don't know, it's kind of a cool, chill character, but, you know, he kind of wants to take the lead a little bit and, you know, protect Joe, and he doesn't want Mr. White kind of harassing his boss, but kind of, you know, sort of playing an alpha dog type character. And then the scene where they kind of introduce you to Vic Vega and his relationship, you know, it paints him as a guy who's willing to go to jail to protect Joe. But then the scene with the cop, you know, Tarantino's done a movie about Hitler and with the main character that chases down Jewish people to capture them. And he did Django Unchained with slave owners. And yet Vic Vega is in a 3-minute scene is one of the most evil people I've ever seen in a movie.
Yeah.
Like, he just enraged me in such little time and disgusted me. This movie is nothing but spoilers, so just stop it now and go watch it and then come back. But having Mr. Orange blast him away was one of the most satisfying things that I've ever seen in a movie.
It's so great. But the funny thing is that, you know, he has the cop tied up and he's pouring gasoline on him, and he's gonna light him on fire. And I'm sitting there watching it, and, you know, I've seen this movie like 2 or 3 other times before. And I'm sitting there watching it like, well, I don't remember the cop catching on fire, but I also don't remember what happened to Vic Vega. And then in the moment of my, like, you know, brain trying to figure out what happened, boom, 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 just blasted to the other side. Orange wakes up, just freaking kills the guy. And yeah, no, it's so good. I have to say, though, that cop is like the unsung hero of the whole film, because, you know, they're torturing him. First, they're beating on him because they want to know who the rat is, who the mole is. And so they beat on him for a while, and he says he doesn't know. And then he's alone with Mr. Blonde, who ties him up, cuts his face with like a straight blade, and then proceeds to cut off his ear, douse him with gasoline, and light him on fire. And you find out that he knows that Mr. Orange is the rat, and he was going to die and be tortured without giving him up.
Yeah, I agree. I also had the thought, too, of like, if he did light him on fire and then Mr. Pink and Mr. White and nice guy Eddie come back, like, what are they going to say about that? Just like, why did, like, First of all, Mr. White would probably just shoot him right then and there because it's just like, what are you doing? And it was also kind of interesting. And Mr. Pink and Mr. White talk about this and kind of a little bit in the beginning after they get into the warehouse. Mr. Pink's like, "Did you have to shoot anybody?" And Mr. White's like, "2 cops." And then Mr. Pink's like, "Well," he's like, "No, like real people. Did you have to shoot any real people?" And he's like, "No." It's like the way they view cops because of what they do is just they don't view them as human. And even though of the actual bad guys, Mr. White is supposed to be kind of like the moral one of them, he's still like not a great person. Like none of those people besides Mr. Orange and the cop are good people. I mean,
Right.
even Mr. Pink, who you're gonna, you could try and say like he's a professional and he has these morals, is a racist. It's just all horrible people in this movie.
Right. I mean, about Mr. Pink being a racist, you hear the N word uh, a lot in this film coming out of Mr. Pink, but also coming out of other characters. And I'm watching this with my girlfriend, and she turns to me and she goes, "Why are they saying that word so much?" And I was like, "Babe, they're bad guys. How else are you going to show them being bad people if they don't use that word?" No,
Well, there's many other ways, but I think it does also exemplify that they're just bad people.
I mean, Quentin Tarantino likes to use that word a lot. I think, of course, in Django he uses it. I believe in Inglorious Bastards, it's used maybe.
I wouldn't. It,
Maybe I know in Pulp Fiction they use it. I mean, he uses the word, but he gives the word to bad people in his stories.
yeah, it's surprising it's not a more controversial element of his movies. It's definitely something people talk about, but I think one, the rest of his movies are so great too. But then also when you have a movie like Django, which is kind of like an escapist, let's kill some slave owners, and you have a let's kill some Nazis movies that people I think are more willing to be like, all right, well, he definitely he's definitely showing like which side he agrees with. So the other thing I noticed about this too is kind of the auteur aspects of the way he shot this. One scene, Mr. Pink is kind of doing it's before Mr. Blonde shows up. Mr. Pink's doing a little bit of a monologue to Mr. White as Mr. Orange has been passed out. I think they're even talking about maybe taking him to the hospital. Mr. Pink's going on and on and on. But the entire shot is of Mr. White, of Harvey Keitel, and his reaction to it. And it's like not something I've ever seen a whole lot of in a movie where the entire shot of someone's monologue is of another person. The
Yeah.
other thing I noticed that was really cool to me, but it also led me astray for a minute. So after you find out that Mr. Orange is a cop, and it goes back and tells his story before this whole day of this bank or this diamond heist, he meets with what you assume to be kind of his like police captain. And once the police captain believes him, there's this shot from outside the diner of them hugging. And in a normal movie, that would be a shot of, Joe Cabot's henchmen like taking a picture of this because they found this out and they've caught him. But
Right.
instead, it was just like Tarantino flexing his muscle a little bit and like, look at this cool shot, and which it was. It didn't really serve a story purpose, but it was just a cool shot, and like I enjoyed that.
It is. You know what? It stuck out to me on this watch also. It's such a voyeuristic shot that you are expecting it to kind of be like a reveal or something like that, and it's not. I felt like that in a couple other places in the film. One of my favorite scenes is he had to practice his undercover story, and his captain was like, "Hey, what's a really convincing undercover story is if you have a funny little anecdote about, a drug deal gone wrong or something." And he's like, "You got to practice this anecdote, like it like the back of your hand. You have to know." In this case, this story takes place in a public bathroom. It's like you got to know if there's doors or stalls. If you got to know if there's crap in the corner of the floor and how clean the toilet seats are and is there a smell. And then they kind of like personify that as like he's telling it, it's showing him doing it, and it turns into one of my favorite scenes.
Especially the scene where he's describing it to his captain, and then the camera pans, and now he's telling it to Joe and Harvey Keitel and Chris Penn, and then it kind of wraps around again, and you see the police, and this is like the kind of the showing of what happened in this fictitious scene, and then it kind of pans around, and it's Mr. Orange telling the story while to these cops basically, but it's really him telling it to at the bar to Joe and Mr. White and nice guy Eddie, and so it's just a really cool, well done scene, and like one of those non sequiturs that it's just like this is such kind of a small movie that takes place in like a compact space, but to add this little backstory and add this cool anecdote. I mean, this scene goes on for maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and so, but it's really, I think it's a nice touch in the movie. Really, really enjoyed it.
I'm telling you, man, this is a cool movie. They stick cool scenes and cool shots because this is just a cool ass movie.
What are you doing?
I'm just saying, it's awesome. You don't even have to be like in the movie or one of the characters to feel as cool as those characters are. You watch it and you feel like 10 times cooler.
Did you ever dress up in a suit with like a colored tie and tell people you were Mr. Orange or Mr. White?
A colored tie? They all have black ties.
I know, but whatever. Anyway, one thing I really, going back to like the detail-oriented nature of it, watching it again when Mr. White is kind of carrying Mr. Orange around, he's like, she had a baby, and you're like, oh, what are you talking about? And then it kind of, you see it eventually when, the shooting happens. And one, because it's low budget, they probably couldn't afford a baby to actually have in the back seat. And then that creates the complications of having these guys who are already evil just stick a baby on the side of the road with their dead mother. But two, also, it's this nice little like, oh, why is he mentioning that she had a baby? These are evil guys. And then you find out, oh, it's because later on, you're going to find out he's the cop. So when you watch it back the first time, it's like, oh, that's a good little piece to put there to kind of, because it's a whodunit, but it's just an interesting movie. Watching it the first time, like I did not care who the narc was, who the undercover cop was. That wasn't really, at least to me, the point of watching this movie. It was to, for the dialogue and then how is this going to play out. But it could have been anyone. In retrospect, it's probably the most obvious. There's so many clues that he leaves at one point when Mr. Blonde and Mr. White and Mr. Pink are all there. Mr. Pink's like, oh, well, I know it's not Mr. Blonde because you're too effing crazy for it to be you. Like, someone who works with cops isn't going to shoot a bunch of people. And he's like, I know it's not me. And he's like, and I'm pretty sure it's not Mr. White. And it's like, all right, well, who's left? You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I mean, it could be someone who's died or who hasn't shown up because there's two guys for a while. You don't know what happened to them, and they don't know what happened to them.
Well, Mr. Brown's dead.
Well, you don't find that until a little later.
No, you find that out in the beginning. He tells Mr. Pink. He's like, because it's one of those things that I had to like look back on, but I think Tarantino, who plays Mr. Brown, gets like shot in the head, but then somehow is able to keep driving for a while and then finally collapses and dies.
Right. But there's the older guy too, right? They don't find out what happens to him until later.
I was pretty sure with how he was acting in the beginning that once we didn't see him come to the warehouse initially, that he wasn't going to be a large part of the rest of this movie.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so we talked about the Steve Miller Band playing in the background, cutting off the ear scene.
Which is just iconic at this point, that song.
Yeah. I know we were talking about Taxi Driver a few episodes ago and how, the you talking to me thing is used over and over, parodied. For this movie, I would say it's definitely the cutting the ear scene is like this movie is you talking to me.
Well, just the dancing too. And then the like going to get the gasoline. What I thought was really cool about that scene is he's dancing to this song. It's a cool scene besides the torture. And then he walks outside and the music cuts because he's listening to a radio. So this is just real to life.
Right.
Gets the gas can. There's just silence. You know, it's the noises of him opening his trunk, closing or whatever, going back in, and then timed up perfectly to where the song would have been, like listening to it again, dancing to it, pouring the gasoline on him. So just, yeah, I mean, such an iconic scene, and it one I kind of knew about, but like lived up to it for sure.
What's funny is after that scene, and the song ends, and he's shot, and everyone's bleeding on the floor, and White, Eddie, Joe, they come in. I kept hearing this like background noise, and to the point where it's like bothering me, and I paused my television, and then the background noise stopped. And then it didn't occur to me. I was like, oh, the radio in the movie is still playing. And I was like, it was kind of funny because it wasn't playing any music. It was just kind of like this low whisper. But yeah, just attention to detail. It's like, yeah, no one turned off the radio. Why wouldn't the radio still be playing?
Yeah, and also I thought the effects on the ear after it was cut off, like the side of his head was, I don't know what that would look like, but it looked amazingly realistic to me.
It was so good. So good. It's like, oh yes, that's where the $1 million went in the 1.2 million budget.
Yeah, I can only imagine what they had to have gotten paid for this, like each guy, because obviously it's a small group.
This is a lot of their like first movies too. Like I think it's one of Tim Roth's first. And it's a couple of those guys like their last movie. Like they were stars back in the day, but when this movie came out, they weren't that big. So I felt like he picked casts that either were just starting out or their career was going down. So they didn't probably have, like, they didn't demand a high pay grade.
Yeah. And one thing, I think obviously we're probably going to talk about the ending and the theories on that. But one thing that was driving me nuts the entire movie was, what does Nice Guy Eddie sound like? And after my second watch, I figured it out. He sounds like a combo of Chunk from the Goonies and Jonah Hill from Superbad when he talks.
Okay, I've never seen the Goonies.
What?
I know. But I totally get the Jonah Hill reference, and I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, we'll have to do the Goonies soon then, so you can confirm.
I have the DVD of the Goonies, never opened, pristine condition. So yeah, I mean, I think everyone did really well. I think, of course, Tim Roth playing Mr. Orange did an incredible job.
When I first, not to interrupt, but I'm going to interrupt. When I first saw the scene in the car, I was like, man, that's kind of like a bit over the top. But watching it back again, I was just like, you know what? That's probably how you act when you've gotten shot. And as Mr. White describes, this is one of the most painful places to get shot because it doesn't kill you. It just hurts. Also freaking out because of all the cops that have gotten killed and the woman he had to shoot. So I actually, upon rewatch, thought that first scene was so well acted.
Yeah. No, I just like, oh my God. And he's just sitting there, and it cuts to him a few times after he's fallen unconscious. And there's just a pool, like a freaking pool of blood. And I'm like, I am curious. I know like getting shot hurts, and I bet getting shot in the gut hurts, and I know you don't die right away. But can someone lose that much blood and still like be alive? But even alive enough to like sit up, put like 5 rounds in a guy's chest, and then fall back down?
Right. I thought the acting was great too, but my one nitpick, back to Nice Guy Eddie, was the part where he's like to Mr. Orange, let me get this straight, and talking about how Mr. Blonde had done this big plan. He's like, and you're telling me this guy was going to turn his back on after what he did to my dad with all the offers he had? I thought that was like not the best. Could have been a little better. Maybe another take. I don't know. I don't want to speak ill of someone who's passed, but I thought the rest of his acting was fine. I thought it was very progressive that when they were torturing the cop to try and find out who the mole was, that he was like, if you torture him, he's just going to tell you whatever you want to hear. He'll tell you that he set the Chicago fire. It doesn't mean it's true. And I was like, oh, wow. nice guy Eddie realizing torture doesn't work and that you can't get accurate information. I was like, very progressive for 1992. That really like stuck out to me.
Way to go, Tarantino. But what that scene did for me is it made me really sweat for Mr. Orange. You know, he had this perfect cover. Mr. White backs him up. He's like, yeah, Mr. Blonde is freaking insane. And he's like, yeah, he was gonna light me. He was gonna light the guy on fire. He's gonna shoot me, shoot you guys, take the diamonds. And then, yeah, nice guy Eddie was like, oh, really? And it just was like, it's a very suspenseful scene.
Yeah, I feel like if Mr. Orange had just said he was going to shoot me and take, so that I didn't get a cut, or he was going to kill me, he started torturing the cop and then said I was next, and he didn't realize that I was passed out. He could, he was dying, so I give him credit. But I mean, a more believable story he might have been able to come up with. Although in hindsight, he didn't know that Vic Vega had this relationship with Joe and his son. So
yeah.
Also, what is up with Eddie calling his dad Daddy the whole time? Weird. It's just weird.
You know, if he actually wasn't the son of Joe and he called him Daddy, I'd be I would think something like
I think you made your point.
No. Okay. There's that definitely. But also it's like Daddy-O. Like he's kind of like the godfather of the group in a way.
I like that they left it vague what Joe was. Obviously, some sort of like
crime boss,
gangster. But what level is he? They mentioned that they have a meeting in Vegas, and so that they got to go to. And it's like that could be kind of a meeting of families across the country. So I like that aspect of because of the way the movie's shot and the story they were telling, that they left certain elements of it, teased at it but left it vague. I thought that was a nice touch.
Agreed.
I wanted to get your thoughts on the ending because there's a couple like sort of left to the imagination what happens. One's obviously for some reason Mr. Orange tells Mr. White that he's a cop, which I don't get because at this point he has a chance to live. Maybe he doesn't think he does because he just got shot again and he's like, I'm going to die. I'm not going to make it to a hospital. And he tells Mr. White he's a cop. So then Mr. White pulls a gun on him. The cops come in, they're like, put the gun down. And then you hear a gunshot, pause, and then several gunshots, which I think is obviously letting you believe Mr. White shot Mr. Orange and then was taken out in like a hail of bullets. And so neither of them lived, which is my takeaway.
Right.
But it's at least left up to interpretation that maybe Mr. White didn't shoot him.
Right. And I think that's my takeaway too is, yeah, they ended up both dying. There's some like people on the internet that are like, oh, well, if you count his bullets between firing at the cops and firing at, nice guy Eddie and Joe, and you take all that into consideration that he didn't have enough bullets to put one into Mr. Orange,
He couldn't reload?
He couldn't reload.
Is that a clips?
Yeah, I don't know. Like maybe it is obvious. Maybe Quentin wanted us to take it at face value. But then again, you have to think if he did, then why was it off camera?
I just had a thought why it was off camera because it had a $1.2 million budget. You can't. How is he going to show a guy getting his head blown off? There, solved. He died. The other question is Mr. Pink. Does he live?
Yes.
And so like watching it back, he has plenty of time to get in a car and get out of there before you hear any signs of police showing up. But one thing I did notice is it almost sounded like a car being unable to start outside.
Yeah.
Like I kept hearing it over and over. And then you hear cops yelling at someone and you hear a bunch of gunshots. So I think that's like left open to be vague, but I could totally, if Tarantino wanted to, and maybe he said, but I don't know, I didn't do any research. If he was just like, no, yeah, he's dead. He got shot. But at the same time, I could totally hear like, oh, they were shooting at him, but he got away. Right. But there's definitely like all this background noise that can leave it open to your imagination of what happened out there, which is, I think, a really cool way to do it. A lot of times I don't like open-ended endings for movies, but if it's really well done, which I think this was, I like it. And I think it was well done.
Yeah, I think those are the two like most popular conspiracy theories um, that go along with this film. I think there's a few more, but those two are definitely the ones worth mentioning. I think this movie has a very high rewatchability that not a lot of movies can have. And I think a lot of that is because of the vagueness. Just the way people freaking enter the room is so cool. Like, yeah, Mr. Blonde, freaking evil guy, bad dude. But man, there is nothing cooler than when he first comes into that warehouse wearing his like what was that, like Tom Cruise from Cocktail glasses, big overcoat, sipping on a soda from a fast food joint, and he's just like, "What the fuck you guys looking at?" And he's smoking a cigarette. I'm like, that is so badass, you know?
Yeah, so this is not, after watching it, not my favorite Tarantino movie. It's amazing. And so saying something's not my favorite Tarantino movie is like saying it's like my least favorite ice cream or pizza. Like it's all great. You know, I love Inglourious Bastards. I just rewatched Django Unchained, and it's great. Like, so intense. His latest, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is amazing. This is great too, and I think what's great about it, as far as being able to watch it again and again, which at some point I will do, is those other three movies are like 2 hours 45 minutes each, and this is a very slim hour and 39 minutes, which makes it so easy to rattle off if you just have some time. And it's just, you know, it's got great dialogue. It's such a 90s movie when you compare it to like his newer stuff. It's like it's got that feel of late 80s, early 90s. But yeah, I'll for sure watch this again. Well, that was our episode. I finally watched Reservoir Dogs. This is David.
And this is Alain. Bye.
Bye.